Sarah Mitchell walked through the automatic doors of St. Mary's Hospital at exactly 6:45 a.m., just as she had every morning for the past 3 years. Her soft-soled nursing shoes squeaked against the polished linoleum floor as she made her way to the cardiac unit on the 4th floor. To anyone watching, she looked like every other nurse starting her 12-hour shift. Her scrubs were perfectly pressed, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her badge hung straight on her chest, identifying her as Sarah Mitchell, RN. What nobody knew was that Sarah Mitchell wasn't her real name. Her real identity was classified at the highest levels of the United States military. Sarah was actually Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone, a former Navy SEAL who had completed 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 classified missions that would never see the light of day in any official report. She had been medically discharged from active duty 18 months ago after taking shrapnel to her left leg during a rescue operation in Kandahar. The doctors had told her she would walk with a slight limp for the rest of her life, but they had no idea about her determination or her pain tolerance. The transition from military life to civilian nursing hadn't been easy. After spending 8 years as one of the few women to successfully complete SEAL training and serve in active combat roles, adjusting to the quiet routine of hospital life felt almost surreal. But Sarah had chosen nursing for a reason. She still wanted to save lives, just in a different way. The adrenaline rush of combat had been replaced by the steady satisfaction of helping patients recover and watching families reunite with their loved ones. Her colleagues at St. Mary's saw her as quiet, but competent. She rarely talked about her past, claiming she had served as a military medic before becoming a nurse. This half-truth was easier than explaining the full reality of her background. She had learned to modulate her voice, to soften the commanding tone that had once directed special operations teams through hostile territory. Her colleagues appreciated her calm demeanor during medical emergencies and her uncanny ability to remain steady under pressure, but they attributed these qualities to natural talent rather than years of training in some of the world's most dangerous situations. Dr. James Harrison, the head of cardiology, had grown particularly fond of Sarah's work ethic. She never complained about overtime, never seemed rattled by difficult patients, and had an almost supernatural ability to anticipate what would be needed during critical procedures. What he didn't know was that Sarah's hypervigilance and tactical awareness were products of years spent in environments where a moment's inattention could mean death for herself or her teammates. On this particular Tuesday morning, Sarah was assigned to the cardiac intensive care unit. Mrs. Eleanor Banks, a 72-year-old grandmother recovering from a triple bypass surgery, was her primary patient. Mrs. Banks had been having a difficult recovery, and her family had been camping out in the waiting room for 3 days straight. Sarah had spent extra time with them the previous evening, explaining the healing process and reassuring them that setbacks were normal in cardiac recovery. As Sarah checked Mrs. Banks' vital signs and adjusted her medications, she noticed the older woman's eyes were open and alert. This was a significant improvement from the previous day when Mrs. Banks had been heavily sedated and barely responsive. "Good morning, Mrs. Banks," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying the gentle warmth she had perfected for patient interactions. "How are you feeling today?" Mrs. Banks tried to speak, but the breathing tube made it impossible. Sarah immediately recognized the frustration in her eyes and reached for a communication board. "Don't try to talk with the tube in. Let's use this board instead. Are you in pain right now?" Mrs. Banks pointed to the number 4 on the pain scale, indicating moderate discomfort. Sarah made a note and adjusted the pain medication drip slightly. She had learned that managing patient comfort was as much about reading body language and nonverbal cues as it was about medical protocols. Her SEAL training had made her exceptionally skilled at reading people, a talent that served her well in patient care. "Your daughter called this morning," Sarah continued as she worked. "She's driving up from Atlanta and should be here by this afternoon. Your son Michael has been sleeping in the waiting room for 2 days. I think I'm going to have to force him to go home for a shower soon." Mrs. Banks managed what looked like a smile around the breathing tube, and Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction of connecting with a patient. These moments reminded her why she had chosen nursing. In her previous life, success was measured in completed missions and eliminated threats. Now, success was measured in improved vital signs and the relief in family members' eyes. Around 10 a.m., Sarah was reviewing medication charts when she noticed something that made her pause. Through her peripheral vision, she had caught sight of two men in the hospital lobby who didn't fit the typical pattern of visitors or staff. They wore casual clothes, but their posture and the way they surveyed the area screamed military or law enforcement training. One was positioned near the main entrance while the other had a clear view of the elevator bank. Their positioning was too deliberate to be coincidental. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She had spent years learning to identify potential threats and assess security situations. These men were conducting surveillance, and they were good at it. Most people would never notice their presence or understand the significance of their positioning. But Sarah wasn't most people. She continued her rounds normally, but now a part of her brain was constantly tracking the men's movements. She used reflective surfaces and strategic positioning to keep them in sight without appearing to watch them. After 30 minutes, she confirmed her suspicions. They were definitely conducting organized surveillance of the hospital, and they were professionals. The question was, why? St. Mary's was a respected hospital in a quiet suburb of Chicago. It wasn't the kind of place that typically attracted the attention of intelligence operatives or sophisticated criminal organizations. Unless someone specific was either working here or being treated here. Someone important enough to warrant this level of professional surveillance. Sarah felt the familiar tingle of adrenaline that she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. Her senses sharpened automatically, and she found herself cataloging exit routes and potential defensive positions without conscious thought. 3 years of civilian life hadn't dulled her tactical instincts one bit. During her lunch break, Sarah decided to do some discreet investigation. She accessed the patient database and reviewed the current census, looking for anyone who might attract unwanted attention. Politicians, celebrities, business leaders, or anyone with a high-profile background. What she found made her blood run cold. Among the patients admitted in the past 48 hours was David Chun, listed as a businessman recovering from a minor heart procedure. But Sarah recognized the name from classified briefings during her final mission in Afghanistan. David Chun wasn't just a businessman. He was a former CIA operative who had been deep undercover in Chinese intelligence operations for over a decade. His extraction from China 6 months ago had been headline news in classified intelligence circles. He had brought with him information about Chinese military capabilities and plans that had shifted American strategic planning in the Pacific. If Chun was here under his real name, it meant his location was supposed to be secure. But the surveillance team downstairs suggested that his cover had been blown. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Chin's intelligence had likely saved thousands of American lives and prevented potential conflicts in the South China Sea. If hostile operatives had tracked him here, they wouldn't just be planning surveillance. They would be planning extraction or elimination. Sarah checked Chin's room assignment. He was on the 7th floor in a private recovery room, scheduled for discharge tomorrow morning. She glanced at her watch. It was 12:30 p.m. If the surveillance team was professional, they would likely make their move during the shift change at 7 p.m. when the hospital was at its most chaotic and security attention was divided. For the first time in 18 months, Sarah felt the weight of operational responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had stumbled into a situation that could have national security implications, and she was the only person in the building who understood the real danger. The question was, what could she do about it? Her first instinct was to contact her former commanding officer, but that would take hours to work through proper channels. Chun could be dead or gone by then. Her second thought was to contact hospital security, but they were civilian guards with no training for this kind of threat. They would be worse than useless against professional operatives. Sarah realized she was going to have to handle this situation herself. The skills she had spent years developing and thought she would never need again were suddenly the only thing standing between a valuable intelligence asset and enemy operatives. She thought about Mrs. Banks, sleeping peacefully in her recovery room, and all the other innocent patients and staff in the building. Whatever was going to happen, she couldn't let civilians get caught in the crossfire. As Sarah returned to her rounds that afternoon, she began developing a tactical assessment of the situation. She identified the surveillance team's positions, mapped the hospital's layout in terms of defensive advantages and vulnerabilities, and began formulating a plan. The quiet nurse who had been invisible to her colleagues for 3 years was about to become very visible indeed. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come to nursing to escape the violence and danger of her military life. But sometimes, the past has a way of finding you, no matter how far you think you've run from it. As the afternoon wore on, and the surveillance team maintained their positions, Sarah accepted the reality of her situation. Tonight, she would have to become Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone again. The only question was whether 3 years of civilian life had dulled her edge enough to get them all killed. The afternoon shift dragged on with agonizing slowness as Sarah maintained her nursing duties while simultaneously conducting her own counter-surveillance operation. She had identified 4 operatives now, not just the original 2. They had positioned themselves strategically throughout the hospital, one in the main lobby, one near the emergency department entrance, one in the parking garage, and one she had spotted through a window in the courtyard area. Their communication was subtle but professional, using hand signals and brief eye contact to coordinate their movements. Sarah used her medical rounds as cover to conduct reconnaissance on the 7th floor where David Chun was recovering. The cardiac surgery wing where she normally worked was on the 4th floor, but she had legitimate reasons to visit other floors during her shift. Delivering lab results, transporting patients, and consulting with other departments gave her the mobility she needed without arousing suspicion. Chen's room was 718, a private recovery suite at the end of a long hallway. The positioning was both good and bad from a security perspective. The room's location made it difficult for casual observers to monitor, but it also made it isolated from immediate help if something went wrong. Sarah noted that the room had a single entrance from the main hallway and windows facing the parking area where she had spotted one of the surveillance operatives. During her visit to the 7th floor, Sarah managed to get a look at Chun without entering his room. Through the partially open door, she could see a man in his 50s lying in bed, appearing to read a newspaper. He looked unremarkable, exactly like the recovering businessman his medical chart claimed he was. But Sarah noticed details that others would miss. The way his eyes tracked movement in the hallway, the positioning of his hands that would allow quick access to the call button or potential weapons, and the fact that he was reading his newspaper in a way that gave him a clear view of the door through his peripheral vision. David Chun was awake, alert, and aware that he might be in danger. The question was whether he had any backup plan or if he was depending entirely on his assumed security. Sarah returned to her assigned floor and began preparing for what she anticipated would be a violent evening. She couldn't access traditional weapons, but hospitals contained numerous items that could serve defensive purposes in the right hands. Medical scissors, scalpels, and various chemicals were readily available. More importantly, she had access to the hospital's security systems and communication networks. Her first step was to establish communication with Chun without alerting the surveillance team. During her 4 p.m. medication round, Sarah prepared a syringe for Mrs. Banks and included a small note written on medical tape. The note read, "Agent in place. Evening extraction attempt likely. Maintain position until contacted." She planned to deliver this message through one of the other nurses who had legitimate business on the 7th floor. The challenge was finding a way to communicate her qualifications without blowing her cover entirely. After some consideration, Sarah wrote a second note that simply said, "Neptune 6 sends regards." Neptune 6 had been Chen's operational code name during the Chinese extraction operation. Only someone with high-level security clearance would know that designation. Sarah approached Jennifer Walsh, a respiratory therapist who regularly made rounds on all floors. "Jen, could you do me a favor? I need to check on a patient's breathing exercises on 7, but I'm swamped down here. Could you drop this medication note off at room 718 when you do your rounds up there?" Jennifer readily agreed, having no idea she was about to become part of a covert intelligence operation. Sarah watched through the security monitors as Jennifer delivered the note to Chen's room. Through the grainy black and white feed, she saw Chun read the note and then look directly at the security camera. For just a moment, he nodded almost imperceptibly. Communication established. Chen now knew that someone in the hospital was aware of his situation and prepared to help. The next step was figuring out how to neutralize 4 professional operatives without getting innocent people killed. As the shift change approached at 7 p.m., Sarah noticed increased activity from the surveillance team. The operative in the lobby had been joined by another man, and they were conducting what appeared to be final equipment checks. Sarah's tactical experience told her that the assault would begin within the next hour. She positioned herself at the nurse's station on the 4th floor where she had access to the hospital's security communication system and could monitor the elevator banks. At 7:15 p.m., she saw 2 men in maintenance uniforms enter through the emergency department. They carried tool bags and walked with the confident purpose of people who belonged there, but Sarah recognized them immediately as additional operatives. The assault team was now in position. Sarah made a decision that would have been impossible to explain to her nursing colleagues. She quietly activated the hospital's emergency lockdown protocol, which sealed external doors and restricted elevator access to authorized personnel. To anyone monitoring the situation, it would appear to be a routine security drill or perhaps a response to a minor incident in the emergency department. The lockdown bought her time, but it also trapped the operatives inside the building with their target. Sarah knew she had perhaps 30 minutes before they adapted to the new situation and continued with their mission. Moving quickly, Sarah gathered supplies from the medical storage areas. She requisitioned items that could serve as improvised weapons and defensive tools, surgical tubing for restraints, injectable sedatives that could incapacitate an attacker, and various chemicals that could create distractions or barriers. She also accessed the hospital's maintenance areas and located the main electrical and communication panels. At 7:45 p.m., the assault began. Sarah first noticed it through the security monitors when the elevator to the 7th floor showed unauthorized movement. The maintenance operatives had somehow gained access to the elevator system despite the lockdown. She immediately activated the emergency communication system and announced a code silver alert, which indicated an armed intruder situation and instructed all staff and patients to shelter in place. The announcement sent the hospital into organized chaos. Nurses began moving patients into secure rooms, security guards took defensive positions, and the building's communication systems lit up with activity. In the confusion, Sarah slipped away from the 4th floor and made her way to the stairwell. She reached the 7th floor just as the elevator doors opened, and 2 men in maintenance uniforms stepped out. They moved with military precision toward room 718, and Sarah could see the outlines of weapons concealed beneath their work clothes. She was positioned at the far end of the hallway, approximately 60 feet from Chen's room and 40 feet from the approaching operatives. Sarah's training took over completely. The careful, gentle nurse persona disappeared, replaced by the tactical mindset that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. She had seconds to act before the operatives reached Chen's room. Moving silently along the wall, Sarah approached the first operative from behind. In one fluid motion, she applied a chokehold that rendered him unconscious in less than 10 seconds. The second operative turned at the sound of his partner falling, but Sarah was already moving. She struck him with a pressure point technique that temporarily paralyzed his right arm, then used his own momentum to drive him into the wall hard enough to knock him unconscious. Both operatives were down within 20 seconds, but Sarah knew there were at least 4 more in the building. She quickly secured their weapons, a pistol and a taser, and checked their communications equipment. Through their radio, she could hear coordination between the remaining team members. They were aware that the assault had encountered resistance and were adapting their plan. Sarah dragged both unconscious men into a supply closet and secured them with surgical restraints. Then, she moved to Chen's room. She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed and clearly ready to move. "Neptune 6, I presume," Chen said quietly. His voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Lieutenant Commander Stone, Navy SEALs," Sarah replied, her military bearing returning automatically. "We need to move. There are at least 4 more hostiles in the building." Chen nodded. "I have extraction protocols, but my contact isn't due for another 6 hours. Can you hold them that long?" Sarah assessed their situation. The hospital was in lockdown, which limited the operatives' options, but also trapped everyone inside. The building's security force consisted of 3 guards with minimal combat training. Local police response would take time to coordinate with federal authorities once they understood the nature of the situation. We're not waiting for extraction, Sarah decided. We're going to neutralize the remaining threats and get you out tonight. Chen raised an eyebrow. You're talking about taking on professional operatives in a building full of civilians. The risk of collateral damage is enormous. The risk of letting them complete their mission is worse, Sarah replied. These people came here to either kill you or take you. I'm not letting either of those things happen. For the first time since entering civilian life, Sarah felt completely in her element. The tactical problems, the life or death stakes, the need to think multiple steps ahead while maintaining operational flexibility. This was what she had been trained for. The question was whether 18 months of nursing had compromised her edge enough to get them both killed. Through the radio she had taken from the operatives, Sarah heard coordination for the next phase of the assault. The remaining team members were regrouping on the 5th floor and planning a more direct approach. They had apparently decided that stealth was no longer possible and were preparing for a more aggressive extraction. Sarah looked at Chun. Can you handle a weapon? Chin's slight smile suggested that his businessman cover story didn't include all of his capabilities. I think I can manage. Sarah handed him the pistol she had taken from the first operative. Stay behind me, cover our 6, and be ready to move fast. We're going to work our way down to the ground floor and find a way out that doesn't involve going through the lobby. As they prepared to leave the room, Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline and tactical clarity that had once been her daily reality. The gentle, invisible nurse was gone. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone was back in action, and she intended to remind these operatives why Navy SEALs had the reputation they did. The hunt was about to begin, and this time, Sarah was the predator. Sarah and Chen moved through the 7th floor corridor with tactical precision, using the alcoves and doorways for cover as they made their way toward the stairwell. The hospital's emergency lighting had activated during the lockdown, creating dramatic shadows that provided excellent concealment for their movement. Sarah led with the taser ready while Chun covered their rear with the pistol. Through the radio communications, Sarah learned that the remaining operatives had split into 2 teams. 2 were working their way up from the ground floor, while 2 others were attempting to access the hospital's security systems to override the lockdown. This confirmed her assessment that they were dealing with professionals who had backup plans for multiple contingencies. As they reached the stairwell door, Sarah held up her hand to signal Chen to stop. She could hear footsteps echoing from below, heavy, measured steps that suggested tactical movement. The operatives were using the stairs to bypass the elevator restrictions, and they were moving upward systematically, probably clearing each floor as they ascended. Sarah keyed the radio she had taken from the unconscious operatives and listened to their communications. The assault team was coordinated and professional, but they were making one critical mistake. They assumed they were hunting a single target who was either hiding or trying to escape. They had no idea they were facing someone with special operations training who had decided to go on the offensive. Change of plans, Sarah whispered to Chun. We're not running. We're going to take them out one by one. Chun looked skeptical. That's a high-risk strategy with significant potential for collateral damage. The collateral damage happens if we let them run free in this building, Sarah replied. They're not going to give up just because they hit some resistance. If we don't stop them here, they'll tear this place apart looking for you. Sarah's tactical mind was working at full speed, drawing on years of combat experience to develop a plan that would use the hospital's unique environment to their advantage. Hospitals were filled with potential hazards and weapons if you knew how to use them properly. Medical gases, electrical systems, chemical storage areas, and complex layouts all provided opportunities for someone with the right training. They moved down 1 floor to the 6th level, which housed the hospital's laboratory and radiology departments. Sarah knew this area would be largely deserted during the evening shift, providing a good location for an ambush. She also knew that the radiology department contained lead-lined rooms that would block radio communications, potentially isolating individual operatives from their team. Sarah positioned Chun in a supply closet with a clear view of the hallway and instructions to provide covering fire if needed. Then, she moved to the radiology department's main entrance and began preparing her trap. The first element was the environment itself. Sarah accessed the building's environmental controls and shut off the heating system for the 6th floor while opening several windows in the radiology waiting area. Within minutes, the temperature began dropping noticeably, and a cold draft was flowing through the corridor. The temperature change would affect the operatives' comfort and potentially their equipment performance. Next, she accessed the medical gas storage area and created a small leak of nitrous oxide in the main corridor. The gas wasn't dangerous in small concentrations, but it would create a distinctive sweet smell that would mask other scents and potentially cause mild disorientation in anyone spending extended time in the area. Finally, Sarah rigged several motion-activated devices using equipment from the radiology department. X-ray machines could be triggered remotely, creating both noise and electromagnetic interference that would disrupt radio communications and night vision equipment. 20 minutes later, Sarah heard the stairwell door open on the 6th floor. Through the radio, she listened as 2 operatives began their floor-by-floor search pattern. They were moving methodically, checking each room and reporting their progress to their teammates. Sarah waited in the radiology control room, watching the corridor through the leaded glass window. She had positioned herself where she could monitor the operatives' approach while remaining invisible to their surveillance. When the first operative rounded the corner into the main corridor, Sarah triggered the first part of her ambush. The X-ray machine activated with a loud whirring sound that echoed through the corridor. Simultaneously, the electromagnetic interference disrupted the operatives' radio communications and any electronic equipment they might be using. The first operative immediately took a defensive position, trying to identify the source of the noise while attempting to contact his partner. Sarah moved silently through the laboratory's connecting corridors, using her knowledge of the building's layout to position herself behind the second operative. She approached from his blind spot and used a restraining technique that rendered him unconscious within seconds. She secured his weapons and radio, then dragged him into a storage room where he couldn't interfere with the rest of the operation. The first operative was now isolated and dealing with equipment malfunctions in an unfamiliar environment. Sarah could see him through the observation windows as he tried to re-establish contact with his team. The nitrous oxide was beginning to affect his concentration, and the temperature drop was making him uncomfortable and slightly sluggish. Sarah activated the second X-ray machine, creating additional noise and confusion. While the operative was distracted by the new sound, she moved through the connecting corridor and positioned herself directly behind him. This time, she used a technique that would leave him conscious but immobilized. She needed information about the overall operation. "Don't move," Sarah said quietly, pressing the taser against the operative's neck. "I need to ask you some questions." The operative was professional enough not to struggle against impossible odds. "You're making a mistake," he said calmly. "This operation has authorization at the highest levels." "Whose authorization?" Sarah asked, maintaining pressure with the taser while checking him for additional weapons. "Need-to-know basis, and you don't need to know," he replied. Sarah had expected this response, but she had to try. Professional operatives rarely broke under simple interrogation, especially when they believed backup was available. She secured him with medical restraints and moved him to join his partner in the storage room. 2 down, at least 2 to go. But Sarah knew the remaining operatives would have heard the disruption in communications and would be adapting their strategy. The element of surprise was diminishing, and the next phase would be more dangerous. Through the radio, Sarah heard the remaining team members coordinating a response to their colleague's disappearance. They were abandoning the systematic search pattern and moving directly toward the 7th floor to secure their primary target. They had apparently decided that speed was more important than caution. Sarah contacted Chun through the hospital's internal communication system. "Neptune 6, this is Stone. 2 down, but the remaining hostiles are moving to your location. I need you to relocate to the emergency stairwell on the east side of the building." "Understood." Chin's voice came back through the intercom. "What's your status?" "I'm moving to intercept the remaining hostiles before they reach you," Sarah replied. "Stay mobile and stay in communication." Sarah gathered the weapons and equipment she had taken from the captured operatives and began moving toward the eastern stairwell. Her plan was to intercept the remaining operatives somewhere between the 4th and 7th floors, where she could use the stairwell's confined space to negate any numerical advantage they might have. As she moved through the hospital corridors, Sarah felt the familiar rhythm of combat operations settling over her. The careful planning, the tactical movement, the constant awareness of multiple variables and potential threats. This was the environment where all her training and experience came together. For the first time in 18 months, she felt completely in control of a dangerous situation. But she also knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The remaining operatives would be expecting resistance now, and they would be prepared for a fight. The element of surprise that had allowed her to neutralize the first 2 targets was gone. From this point forward, she would be facing trained professionals who knew they were in a combat situation. Sarah reached the eastern stairwell just as she heard footsteps echoing from several floors below. The remaining operatives were moving fast, taking the stairs 2 at a time in their rush to reach Chen's location. Sarah positioned herself on the landing between the 5th and 6th floors, where she would have the tactical advantage of elevation and cover. She checked her weapons, the taser from the first operative, a pistol from the second, and various improvised weapons she had gathered from the medical supplies. Not ideal for a firefight, but sufficient if she used them correctly. As the footsteps grew closer, Sarah prepared for what she knew would be the most dangerous few minutes of the entire operation. Everything depended on her ability to stop 2 professional operatives in a confined space without letting them get past her to reach Chun. The gentle nurse who had spent 3 years caring for cardiac patients was about to demonstrate why Navy SEALs were among the most feared warriors in the world. The battle for St. Mary's Hospital was about to reach its climax. The footsteps in the stairwell grew louder as Sarah positioned herself behind the concrete barrier on the 6th floor landing. She had less than 30 seconds before the remaining operatives reached her position. Through their radio communications, she could hear them coordinating their final assault on Chen's location. They were moving with desperate urgency, knowing that their mission was falling apart. Sarah's tactical assessment was clear: 2 experienced operatives, probably armed with superior weapons, moving fast through a confined space. Her advantages were position, surprise, and intimate knowledge of the building layout. Her disadvantages were being outnumbered and outgunned by professionals who knew they were in a fight. The first operative rounded the corner between the 5th and 6th floors, moving with his weapon drawn and ready. Sarah waited until he was committed to the stairway before acting. She triggered a small explosive device she had improvised from medical oxygen canisters and cleaning chemicals, creating a flashbang effect that temporarily blinded and disoriented both operatives. In the confusion that followed, Sarah moved with lethal precision. She struck the first operative with a combination that neutralized his weapon and sent him tumbling down the stairs. The second operative was already adapting to the flashbang, but Sarah was faster. She used the stairwell's railings to gain elevation advantage and struck him from above with a technique that rendered him unconscious immediately. Both operatives were down, but Sarah knew the situation was far from over. Through the radio, she could hear additional communications indicating that backup teams were en route to the hospital. The initial assault had been just the first wave of a larger operation. Sarah quickly secured the weapons from the unconscious operatives and contacted Chun through the hospital's communication system. Neptune 6, this is Stone. 4 hostiles down, but we have additional inbound. We need to evacuate immediately. Roger that. Chen's voice came back. What's our extraction route? Sarah's mind raced through the hospital's layout and the tactical situation outside. The building was still in lockdown, but the approaching backup teams would have the capability to override those systems. She needed a way to get Chun out of the hospital without using any of the main exits that would be under surveillance. Meet me in the basement level near the hospital's loading dock, Sarah instructed. I have an idea, but we need to move fast. As she made her way down to the basement, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the past few hours. That morning, she had been Sarah Mitchell, the quiet cardiac nurse. Now she was Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone again, conducting a combat operation in the middle of a civilian hospital. The transition felt both jarring and strangely natural. The basement level of St. Mary's Hospital housed the building's mechanical systems, storage areas, and service entrances. More importantly, it connected to a network of utility tunnels that linked the hospital to adjacent buildings. Sarah had discovered these tunnels during her orientation training 3 years ago, but had never imagined she would need to use them for a covert escape operation. Chen arrived at the loading dock area within minutes, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years in dangerous situations. "What's the plan?" he asked, assessing their surroundings with professional interest. "Service tunnels," Sarah explained, indicating a maintenance access door near the loading dock. "They connect to the office building next door, which has an underground parking garage. We can exit through there without going anywhere near the main hospital entrances." Chen nodded approvingly. "Simple and effective. What about the backup teams?" "They'll expect us to either hold up somewhere in the hospital or try to break out through one of the main exits," Sarah said as she opened the maintenance door. "This gives us a way out that's not on any of their tactical plans." The utility tunnels were narrow and dimly lit, designed for maintenance workers rather than tactical movement. Sarah led the way with a flashlight she had taken from one of the captured operatives, while Chun followed close behind. The tunnels ran for about 200 yards underground, connecting the hospital's mechanical systems to the adjacent office complex. As they moved through the tunnels, Sarah could hear sirens in the distance, indicating that law enforcement was finally responding to the situation at the hospital. She hoped that Dr. Harrison and her other colleagues were safe, and that the hospital's emergency protocols had protected the patients and staff from the violence that had erupted in their normally peaceful facility. They emerged from the tunnels in the basement of the office building next door. Sarah used her lock-picking skills, a talent she had acquired during her special operations training, to gain access to the building's parking garage. Within minutes, they were standing in the underground garage, surrounded by civilian vehicles and completely invisible to any surveillance teams that might be monitoring the hospital. "Now what?" Chen asked. "My extraction team isn't due for another 4 hours, and after tonight's events, the original rendezvous point is probably compromised." Sarah considered their options. They needed transportation, a secure location to wait for proper extraction, and a way to communicate with Chen's handlers without using potentially compromised channels. She also needed to ensure that her cover identity remained intact. If possible, she wanted to return to her nursing career without having her true background exposed. "I have a safe house," Sarah said finally. "It's not official, but it's secure. We can wait there while you contact your people through alternate channels." Chen raised an eyebrow. "You maintain a safe house as a civilian nurse?" Sarah's slight smile suggested there was still a lot about Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone that even a veteran intelligence operative didn't understand. Old habits die hard. They appropriated a vehicle from the parking garage. Sarah's military training had included automotive acquisition techniques that proved useful in civilian contexts, and drove through the quiet suburban streets towards Sarah's apartment. Behind them, the lights and sirens at St. Mary's Hospital indicated that the authorities were dealing with the aftermath of the evening's events. Sarah's apartment was a modest 2-bedroom unit in a residential complex about 10 miles from the hospital. What wasn't immediately apparent was that she had subtly modified it with security features that would make it defensible against most threats. Reinforced doors, security cameras, and emergency communication equipment were hidden throughout the apartment in ways that appeared completely normal to casual observation. "Impressive," Chen said as he noted the apartment's defensive modifications. "You really couldn't leave it all behind, could you?" "I tried," Sarah admitted. "But after 8 years of living in a world where being unprepared could get you killed, it's hard to adjust to civilian life where people assume they're safe." Chen used Sarah's secure communication equipment to contact his extraction team and report the evening's events. While he coordinated his pickup, Sarah monitored police and emergency service communications to track the response at the hospital. She was relieved to learn that no patients or staff had been injured during the operation, and that the 4 captured operatives were in police custody. 3 hours later, a black sedan arrived at Sarah's apartment complex. Chun gathered his few belongings and prepared to leave for a more secure location while his handlers arranged his permanent relocation to a safer cover identity. "I have to ask," Chen said as he prepared to leave, "what made you decide to help tonight? You could have called security and stayed out of it." Sarah considered the question. I became a nurse because I wanted to keep saving lives, just in a different way than I had in the military. Tonight, saving lives meant going back to my old methods. Chen shook hands with Sarah at the door. For what it's worth, Neptune 6 is grateful. You probably saved my life tonight. Just glad I could help, Sarah replied. Take care of yourself out there. After Chen left, Sarah sat in her apartment and contemplated the events of the past 12 hours. She had successfully protected an intelligence asset, neutralized multiple hostile operatives, and prevented what could have been a significant breach of national security. But she had also exposed herself to scrutiny and questions that could compromise the quiet civilian life she had built. The next morning, Sarah returned to St. Mary's Hospital for her regular shift. The building was still buzzing with activity from the previous night's events, but operations had returned to normal. Dr. Harrison approached her during the morning rounds with a curious expression. Sarah, the FBI agents investigating last night's incident asked about you specifically, he said. Apparently, several of the hospital's security cameras showed you moving through the building during the lockdown in ways that suggested tactical training. They wanted to know about your military background. Sarah had expected this conversation. I told them I served as a military medic before becoming a nurse. That training included basic security and emergency response protocols. Dr. Harrison studied her face for a moment. The agents seemed to think your actions were more sophisticated than basic training would explain. They also said the attackers were neutralized by someone with advanced combat skills. Sarah maintained her composed expression. I'm not sure what they're suggesting, Dr. Harrison. I was just trying to help protect the patients and staff. Dr. Harrison nodded slowly. Well, whatever really happened last night, I'm glad you were here. Mrs. Banks asked about you this morning, by the way. She said you were the kindest nurse she's ever had. Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time since the crisis began. How is she doing? Much better. She'll probably be discharged tomorrow. Sarah returned to her rounds, checking on Mrs. Banks and her other patients. The elderly woman was indeed improving rapidly, and her family was relieved and grateful for the care she had received. As Sarah monitored Mrs. Banks' recovery and provided comfort to her family, she reflected on the dual nature of her life. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone would always be part of who she was. The training, the instincts, and the willingness to face danger to protect others were fundamental aspects of her character. But Sarah Mitchell, the cardiac nurse, was equally real and equally important. Both identities were dedicated to preserving life, just through different methods. Over the following weeks, the FBI investigation concluded that the hospital had been attacked by a sophisticated criminal organization that had been neutralized by unknown individuals with military training. No charges were filed against hospital staff, and the incident was classified due to its connection to ongoing intelligence operations. Sarah continued her nursing career at St. Mary's, maintaining the quiet, competent persona that her colleagues had always known. But, occasionally, when particularly challenging situations arose, her colleagues noticed that Sarah Mitchell seemed to possess an unusual combination of calm authority and tactical awareness that went beyond typical medical training. Dr. Harrison never asked directly about Sarah's background again, but he began assigning her to situations that required exceptional skill and judgment. Other staff members began to notice that emergencies somehow seemed more manageable when Sarah was involved, though they couldn't quite explain why. 3 months after the incident, Sarah received a letter with no return address. Inside was a brief note. Neptune 6 sends his regards and hopes the quiet life is treating you well. Your country remains grateful for your continued service in whatever form it takes. Sarah smiled as she read the note, then destroyed it according to protocols she remembered from another life. She returned to her patient rounds, checking on the cardiac recovery patients who depended on her expertise and compassion. Sarah Mitchell, RN, had found her place in the world. And if the world occasionally needed Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone to protect that place, she would be ready. Some types of service never really end. They just take different forms. The quiet nurse who seemed so ordinary was, in fact, exactly as extraordinary as she had always been. She had simply learned to serve in a new way, saving lives one patient at a time instead of one mission at a time. But when the stakes demanded it, she could still be the warrior she had always been. The gentle hands that administered medication and provided comfort were the same hands that could neutralize threats and protect the innocent. Sarah had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose when to reveal your true strength. And in the cardiac unit of St. Mary's Hospital, surrounded by the quiet beeping of monitors and the soft sounds of healing, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone continued her mission under the gentle cover of Sarah Mitchell, RN. Ready for whatever came next,